Tara Johnson entered the courtroom with a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the space around her as she stepped forward to the front row, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She glanced around, noticing the murmurs of the people seated in the gallery, most of them casting curious glances in her direction. As she took her place, she was used to this kind of attention, but never welcomed that she had learned early on that people underestimated her because of the color of her skin or the fact that she was a woman, but she had long ago grown accustomed to their looks of surprise when they realized she wasn't like most people who walked into courtrooms unsure or intimidated by the surroundings. Tara was anything but intimidated. She was here on a mission, and she wasn't about to let anyone distract her from that mission. She was here to represent herself in a civil case involving a property rental dispute. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, reading through legal documents, poring over every possible precedent, and consulting with legal professionals who had been kind enough to give their advice. She had studied the ins and outs of landlord-tenant law and was confident that her case was sound. She was ready, and she knew the judge wouldn't be expecting her to hold her own in this environment. As the proceedings began, Judge Gregory Mason took his seat on the bench, his stern eyes scanning the courtroom with a practiced glance. Tara noticed him immediately. His expression was one of focused authority, but also a touch of impatience. He had seen countless cases like hers before and likely didn't think there was anything remarkable about a woman representing herself in a small property dispute. He glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the file in front of him. Without a word, he cleared his throat and gestured for the case to proceed. Tara stood and introduced herself calmly, her voice ringing out clearly across the courtroom. Despite the slight nerves in her chest, she started to outline her case, presenting the facts one by one without hesitation. She spoke with conviction, the words flowing smoothly from her lips as she explained the dispute she had with her landlord, who had violated terms of their rental agreement. The judge barely looked at her as she spoke, his focus seemingly elsewhere as he scrolled through papers on his desk. Tara felt a flicker of frustration rise inside of her, but she quickly tamped it down. She wasn't here to get caught up in his indifference. She was here to make her case, and she wasn't going to let anything throw her off course. As she continued presenting her argument, she could feel the judge's disinterest turning into irritation. He began to interrupt her, speaking over her as she tried to clarify key points, his tone sharp and dismissive each time he cut her off. She held her ground, not allowing his interruptions to derail her, but with each passing moment, she could sense his growing frustration with her presence. The more she spoke, the more annoyed he seemed to become. Finally, in the middle of her explanation, he slammed his gavel down with a force that made everyone in the room jump, and before she could respond, he snapped at her. Asterisk. Enough, asterisk, he said sharply. Asterisk. You're disrupting the order of this court. I'm fining you for your behavior if you don't calm down and follow the procedure. Asterisk. Tara froze for a moment, shock sweeping through her, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she stood tall and met his gaze with a calm resolve. She wasn't going to let this judge make her feel small. She knew she had every right to be here, and she wasn't going anywhere. The room fell silent after the judge's command. Tara stood still, her heart pounding, but she didn't flinch. She had expected resistance, but this sudden punishment took her by surprise. A quiet rage simmered beneath her composed exterior. How dare he make assumptions about her ability to navigate this space? She had done her homework, poured countless hours into preparing for this very moment, and yet here she was being dismissed as an inconvenience. His harsh words echoed in her mind as she stood tall, refusing to let the sting of his judgment show. Tara took a breath and nodded slowly, acknowledging the fine. She knew arguing in the heat of the moment would only play into his hands. The courtroom was still, the eyes of those present quietly shifting between the judge and her. Despite the discomfort in the air, Tara remained focused. She wasn't going to let a fine dictate the outcome of her case. Asterisk, she could handle this. Asterisk, she thought. Asterisk, this was just one step in a much bigger journey. Asterisk. The judge's gavel fell again, his voice cutting through the tension. Asterisk. The fine is imposed. Asterisk, he said firmly, not giving her a chance to respond. With that, he motioned for the proceedings to continue. Tara sat back down, her hands resting on the table in front of her. She couldn't show any sign of the internal storm that was brewing. Her mind was already racing, thinking of the next steps. She had to keep her composure. She had to stay on track. The fine was a setback, but it wasn't the end. The rest of the hearing played out in a blur. Tara continued presenting her case, despite the judge's harsh interruptions and condescending remarks. He seemed determined to undermine her at every turn, questioning her legal knowledge and dismissing her points without considering their validity. But Tara was unshaken. She knew she had the facts. She knew she had the law on her side, and if Judge Mason couldn't see that, it was his loss. The court session dragged on, and each moment felt like a battle she had to fight in isolation. By the time the hearing was over, Tara had said everything she needed to say, but the damage had already been done. She felt the weight of the fine pressed down on her shoulders as she stood to leave. The judge had already turned his attention to the next case, barely acknowledging her exit. As she walked out of the courtroom, her mind raced. The fine wasn't just about money, it was about the message it sent. Tara was all too familiar with how people like Judge Mason often dismissed people like her, black, confident women who didn't fit the mold of what they expected to see in a courtroom. But she had a plan. She would fight this. She wouldn't let his bias define her or the outcome of this case. In the days that followed, Tara's phone rang constantly with support from colleagues in the legal field, some who knew her well and others who had heard about the way the judge treated her. They offered words of encouragement, letting her know that she wasn't alone. But Tara knew this fight would be bigger than just this case. It was about challenging the system, challenging the ingrained biases that held people back simply because of how they looked or where they came from. And so she made a decision. She would push forward with her case, and if necessary, she would take it further. The fine, while unjust, had only fueled her determination to prove herself, not just to Judge Mason, but to the entire legal system that had failed to see her for who she truly was. The days following the hearing were a blur of mixed emotions for Tara. The fine was a bitter pill to swallow, but it only strengthened her resolve to prove Judge Mason wrong. She couldn't let the injustice of that courtroom moment define her or her future. Tara spent every free moment researching case law, studying precedents, and reviewing the very arguments she had made before the judge. Every document she touched seemed to fuel her determination to get things right. She was going to take this fight beyond the courtroom if she had to. It wasn't long before news of the courtroom incident spread through the legal community. Tara had been well known in legal circles, albeit in the background for years. She had spent her career working with attorneys, preparing legal briefs, conducting research, and offering strategy. She was a trusted resource for the most skilled lawyers who appreciated her expertise and relied on her knowledge. She had never sought the spotlight, preferring instead to help others succeed in the legal field. But now, with the fine hanging over her head, the story of the woman who had been fined for speaking up in court spread like wildfire. Soon, legal professionals began reaching out to Tara, expressing their support. Some were familiar faces, others strangers who had heard about the incident through the grapevine. Tara had always been a quiet but respected figure in the legal world, but now she found herself in the midst of something larger, something that felt bigger than just a single case. She had inadvertently become a symbol for those who had been overlooked or dismissed by the very system they sought to navigate. Judge Gregory Mason, meanwhile, had found himself struggling with his own thoughts. The events of the hearing haunted him more than he cared to admit. He had been quick to dismiss Tara, assuming she was just another amateur without the legal knowledge to back her claims. But something about the way she had presented her case lingered in his mind. The precision in her arguments, the confidence in her delivery. It was all too clear that she wasn't just some inexperienced woman fumbling through legal terms. Tara had known what she was talking about. She had made valid points, ones that any seasoned lawyer would have made. It wasn't until a colleague had mentioned Tara's name again, this time in a different context, that Judge Mason began to pay closer attention. His colleague had been discussing a legal brief Tara had written, a document that had recently been circulated in legal circles. Tara's insights had impressed many, and the brief was praised for its sharp analysis and thorough research. Judge Mason had a nagging feeling he recognized the name. A few hours later, he stumbled upon an article written by her, one that was widely respected in the legal community. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Tara Johnson, the same woman he had dismissed so quickly in his courtroom, was a well-respected courtroom specialist. Tara wasn't just a random litigant. She had years of experience working behind the scenes with some of the best lawyers in the field. Her expertise was invaluable, and yet he had treated her as though she didn't belong in his courtroom. He felt a deep sense of regret wash over him. How had he been so blind? Judge Mason found himself staring at the same article for what seemed like hours, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had not only wronged Tara, but that he had let his own biases cloud his judgment. His once impressive authority now felt fragile. He had misjudged Tara in the most fundamental way, and it was a mistake he wasn't sure how to fix. Judge Gregory Mason couldn't shake the thought of Tara Johnson. Her name, once just another face in the court system, now echoed in his mind with a persistent clarity he couldn't ignore. The more he thought about it, the more his mistake gnawed at him. How had he been so quick to dismiss her? He was a seasoned judge, a man who prided himself on his ability to read people and assess situations with a practiced eye. Yet, in Tara's case, he had failed miserably. The realization hit him hard. He had let his own assumptions guide his actions, not the facts before him. Tara wasn't just any self-represented litigant. She was someone who had honed her legal mind through years of experience in the courtroom. She had worked behind the scenes for top attorneys, preparing legal briefs, offering strategy, and even assisting with high-profile cases. Her expertise in the legal field was far beyond what Judge Mason had originally perceived. He had thought her lack of a lawyer meant she didn't belong in the courtroom or that she couldn't handle a legal dispute on her own. But now, after reading her article and reviewing her work, it was clear to him that Tara was far more qualified than many of the attorneys who practiced before him. The sense of embarrassment grew as he realized that not only had he misjudged her, but his actions had also reinforced the biases that often plagued the legal system, biases that dismissed those who didn't fit the traditional mold of authority in court. Tara's calm confidence had been mistaken for arrogance, her preparedness mistaken for a lack of understanding of legal procedures. But now, in the privacy of his office, Judge Mason found himself questioning everything. His own biases, the ones he had long assumed were inconsequential, had led him to make a grave error. For days, Judge Mason couldn't focus on anything else. He kept replaying the hearing in his mind, his words to Tara, the fine he had imposed on her. The sense of guilt weighed heavily on him, but he knew there was only one way to make things right. He needed to seek her out and offer an apology, not just for the fine, but for the way he had treated her. He needed to acknowledge that he had failed to see her for what she truly was, an expert, a professional, and someone deserving of respect. It wasn't long before he found a way to track her down. After a few calls and messages, Judge Mason arranged to meet Tara for a face-to-face conversation. He wasn't sure how she would react to his apology, but he knew he had to try. The weight of his error had become unbearable, and he realized that confronting it head-on was the only way to begin to correct the wrong he had done. When the meeting was scheduled, he prepared himself. He spent hours thinking about what he would say, trying to find the right words to express his regret and his realization. He was aware that Tara might not be ready to forgive him, but he couldn't allow that to deter him. He had to take responsibility for his actions, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Finally, the day arrived. Judge Mason stood outside a small cafe, nervously checking his watch. He saw her before she saw him. Tara, dressed simply yet elegantly, walking toward him with the same quiet strength he had noticed in the courtroom. She wasn't looking for drama or attention. She was just here to face him, and he could see it in her eyes that she wasn't holding a grudge. As she approached, he took a deep breath and said, "Ms. Johnson, I owe you an apology. I was wrong. I misjudged you, and I regret that deeply." Tara paused for a moment, looking at him with a calm yet measured gaze. She had expected some form of apology, but not one from a man like him. It took a lot of courage for him to stand there, humbled, waiting for her response. Tara stood still for a moment, her eyes meeting Judge Mason's with an unreadable expression. She had been bracing herself for this moment ever since she learned of the judge's growing doubts, but now that it had arrived, she was unsure of what to make of it. She had been right all along. He had been wrong about her. But was an apology enough? Could she really trust that he had changed? Or was this just another instance of someone with power attempting to absolve themselves of guilt? She remained silent for a beat, letting the weight of the situation linger. Judge Mason shifted slightly, his face softening, but Tara didn't rush to answer. The cafe was bustling with activity around them, but in that moment, the world seemed to fade away. The space between them was filled with tension, but also with the knowledge that something important was happening, something that could shift not only their relationship, but perhaps something much larger than that. Finally, Tara spoke, her voice calm but firm. "You're right," she said, her words cutting through the silence. "You did misjudge me, but that's not what bothers me the most." Judge Mason blinked, surprised by her response. She continued, "What bothers me is that you, someone who holds a position of authority in the court system, acted on assumptions without even bothering to consider the full picture." Her words were not meant to attack, but to make him realize the depth of his error. He nodded slowly, absorbing what she was saying. He had seen it before, judgments made based on appearances, or quick conclusions based on outdated notions of who belonged in the courtroom. He knew that he had been guilty of the very thing Tara was pointing out. His eyes met hers again, and for the first time, there was no judgment in his gaze, only a deep understanding of his own failure. "I understand," Judge Mason said quietly, "and I'm sorry. I can't undo what I did, but I want to learn from it. I want to make things right, not just between us, but in the system as a whole. I've spent years on the bench, but I've never truly stopped to think about the biases I carry with me. This situation has opened my eyes to how those biases can affect the way I see people. People like you, people who shouldn't have to fight against those prejudices just to be heard." Tara studied him for a long moment, taking in his words. She had heard apologies before, but something about the way Judge Mason spoke now felt different. There was no defensiveness, no excuses, just a man who had come to terms with his own mistakes and was willing to take responsibility for them. Tara didn't expect her battle to end here, but she knew this conversation was a crucial step towards something more meaningful. She had been fighting the system her entire career, and now, it seemed, she had the opportunity to make a real change. "I'm not here just for myself, Judge Mason," Tara said, her voice growing more resolute. "I'm here for all the people who have been overlooked or dismissed by the legal system. People who have faced biases just because of who they are, what they look like, or how they speak. This isn't just about me proving myself. It's about changing a system that needs to evolve." Judge Mason listened intently, feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't just about an apology, it was about taking real action. "And how do you suggest we do that?" he asked, his voice full of genuine curiosity. Tara smiled slightly, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "By acknowledging that change needs to happen, by giving people like me the chance to be seen and heard, not just as others, but as equals in the legal world. We need a more inclusive approach to law, one that values knowledge and skill above all else, regardless of who is sitting at the table." Judge Mason nodded again, understanding that this was no small task, but one worth pursuing. "I'd like to work with you," he said. "If you're willing, I want to help you make that change happen. Together." Tara's heart quickened at his words. She had spent so much of her life fighting for justice, but now, it seemed, she had an unexpected ally in Judge Mason. A partnership that could, perhaps, finally help move the needle in the direction of true reform. Tara paused for a moment, the weight of Judge Mason's words sinking in. She had fought so long on her own, pushing through obstacles, breaking down doors that had been closed to her for far too long. The idea of working alongside the very judge who had dismissed her in court felt surreal. Could she trust him? Could she really believe that he, a man who had let his biases cloud his judgment, would now be the one to help create real change? But something in his eyes told her that this wasn't just another empty promise. There was sincerity in his voice, and the regret that had plagued him for days now seemed to drive his actions. He had seen the errors in his behavior, and perhaps for the first time, he was ready to challenge the system he had long been a part of. Tara weighed her options carefully. She had always prided herself on her independence, on the fact that she had carved out a place for herself in a system that didn't always value her. Yet, as she looked at Judge Mason, she realized that sometimes change didn't have to come from just one person. It could come from collaboration, from working together to dismantle the very systems that held people back. I'm willing to consider it, Tara said slowly, her voice thoughtful. But I need to see that you're not just talking about change. I need to see that you're ready to do the work that will make it happen. This isn't about token gestures or empty words. It's about real reform. Judge Mason nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. He had no illusions about the difficulty of the task ahead, but he was willing to take the first step. I promise you, Tara, I'm ready to do the work. I'm committed to making the changes that need to be made. I've already started looking into bias training for my colleagues, and I want to be part of the conversation about how we can make the legal system more inclusive for everyone. If you're willing to work with me, I'll be here every step of the way. Tara studied him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity. She had been let down by people in power before, but something about Judge Mason's words felt different. There was no arrogance, no air of superiority in his tone, only a genuine desire to change. And Tara, for the first time in a long time, felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. All right, Tara said, a small smile tugging at her lips. I'm in. But know this, Judge Mason, I'm not here to play by the old rules. If we're going to make real change, we have to be bold. We have to challenge the very foundations of the system that perpetuates injustice. The judge's eyes lit up with understanding. I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Tara. Let's do it then. Let's make this system something it should have always been, a place where people are treated equally, no matter who they are. Over the next few weeks, Tara and Judge Mason worked tirelessly. They met regularly, brainstorming ideas and discussing concrete steps to bring about change. They started with the basics: bias training for judges and lawyers, seminars on inclusivity, and creating a support network for self-represented litigants who often felt invisible in the court system. But they knew that real change would take time, and they had no intention of rushing it. Every step they took was calculated, ensuring that they didn't just make noise, but actually made an impact. The legal community began to take notice. Tara's story, once one of frustration and dismissal, was now one of empowerment and change. She wasn't just fighting for her own voice to be heard anymore. She was fighting for the voices of countless others who had been silenced by the biases embedded in the system. As their efforts gained traction, Tara felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Hope that the system could change, hope that real justice could be achieved, and hope that, together, she and Judge Mason could be part of something much bigger than themselves. Weeks turned into months, and Tara's partnership with Judge Mason grew stronger. They were no longer just two individuals working on a legal case. They had become partners in a larger mission to reform a broken system. Every meeting was filled with new ideas, fresh perspectives, and a shared determination to create real, lasting change. Together, they pushed for initiatives that would not only address the biases that had plagued the courtroom, but also give voice to those who had been marginalized for far too long. Tara's efforts were gaining attention outside of the courtroom as well. Her story, once a tale of dismissal and unfairness, had now become a symbol of resilience and empowerment. Legal professionals across the country began reaching out to her, eager to learn more about her work with Judge Mason and how they could contribute to similar initiatives in their own jurisdictions. The ripple effect was undeniable. Despite all the progress, Tara knew there was still a long road ahead. While the support for their reform efforts was growing, there were still many who resisted the idea of change. Long-held traditions, ingrained biases, and systemic inequalities were not easy to uproot. She faced opposition from both colleagues and members of the legal community who were not as eager to embrace the idea of inclusivity and diversity in law. But with each step, Tara grew more resolute. She wasn't in this fight for the short-term victories. She was in it for the long haul. One afternoon, as they were wrapping up a meeting, Judge Mason looked at Tara with a thoughtful expression. You know, I never thought I'd be in this position, he said, his voice tinged with admiration. I've spent so many years on the bench, following the rules as they were set out, thinking I was doing my part. But I was blind to the way those rules were stacked against people who weren't like me. Tara nodded, understanding exactly where he was coming from. She had spent her entire career fighting against the same system that Judge Mason had unknowingly been a part of. It's not easy to confront your own biases, she said, her voice gentle but firm. It takes a lot of courage to admit that the way you've been doing things isn't the right way, especially when it's a system that has worked in your favor. But you're doing the right thing now. Judge Mason smiled, a look of determination crossing his face. I've learned so much from you, Tara. I've learned that it's not enough to be neutral. It's not enough to simply not discriminate. We have to actively fight for equality, for fairness, and for justice. Tara smiled back. That's exactly it. Neutrality isn't enough. We have to make sure that everyone, no matter who they are, has an equal shot at justice. In the months that followed, their work began to bear fruit. New programs were implemented to help self-represented litigants navigate the complex legal system. Judges and attorneys underwent comprehensive training on implicit bias and cultural competency. And perhaps most importantly, the legal community began to shift its perspective on who belonged in the courtroom. Tara's own role began to evolve as well. She was no longer just a behind-the-scenes expert, assisting other lawyers with their cases. Now she was leading the charge, speaking at conferences, participating in panels, and working directly with reform committees. She had become a leader in a movement that was gaining momentum by the day. And yet, even as she achieved new heights, she never lost sight of the reason she started this journey in the first place: to make sure that people like her, people who had been overlooked, underestimated, and undervalued, finally had a seat at the table. The fight was far from over, but Tara knew they were on the right path. The day arrived when Tara stood before a room full of legal professionals, judges, and advocates at a national legal conference. She had been invited to speak about the work she had done with Judge Mason and the broader reforms they had championed. It felt like a full circle moment. Just a year ago, she had been dismissed in that very courtroom, fined for something as simple as speaking up. And now here she was, on a stage, sharing her story with the very people who had once been blind to the flaws in the system. Tara looked out at the crowd, her nerves tingling in the familiar way they always did before she spoke publicly. But this time, there was a quiet confidence in her that hadn't been there before. She had fought for her voice to be heard, and now it was echoing across the legal community. I stand before you today, she began, her voice steady but powerful, not as a victim of the system, but as someone who has learned to challenge it. We've all seen the ways the legal system can fail, how it can favor some while leaving others behind. But I'm here to tell you that we don't have to accept it. Change is possible. I've seen it happen, and I've been part of that change. The room was silent as Tara spoke, every word she uttered carrying the weight of her journey. She spoke not just of her own experiences, but of the countless others who had been silenced by biases, by assumptions, by a system that didn't always value equality. She talked about the work she and Judge Mason had done together, the training programs, the reform initiatives, and the ongoing battle to create a legal system that truly served everyone. She didn't shy away from the difficult truths. We can't keep pretending that the system works for everyone, she continued. We can't keep ignoring the voices of those who are marginalized. It's not enough to passively say that we're equal in a system that doesn't treat us that way. We need to actively fight for that equality, for that fairness, every single day. As she spoke, Tara could see nods of agreement in the crowd. The seeds of change had been planted, and now it was a matter of continuing to nurture them, to push for further reform. Tara knew that the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. There were still battles to fight, still prejudices to undo, and still policies to change. But the momentum they had created together, Tara, Judge Mason, and all the other legal professionals who had joined the cause, was undeniable. After her speech, Tara was approached by a number of colleagues who expressed their support and admiration for her work. Some were attorneys she had worked with in the past, while others were new faces inspired by her words. One by one, they expressed a desire to help continue the work she had started, to contribute in any way they could. Tara knew that the movement they had begun was bigger than any one person. It was a collective effort, and it would take a collective commitment to sustain the change they were working toward. As the conference came to a close, Tara and Judge Mason stood together, reflecting on the progress they had made. Tara had once been silenced, dismissed as an outsider, but now she was leading a movement that would, in time, reshape the legal system from the inside out. And while she knew that there would always be more work to be done, she was no longer fighting alone. She had found allies in unexpected places. She had found a voice in a system that had tried to silence her. And most importantly, she had found the strength to change the system itself.